Mr. Brookie, thank you so much for this interview. I want to ask you at the beginning, 2024, biggest election year in the world, blah, 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 but what connects the, let's call it, disinformation space in Europe and in the US, in your opinion?
Well, this election year is, number one, the largest election year in global history. So 4.2 billion people, more than half of the world's population, are going to the polls in some shape or form. Now, in some cases, that's in really robust democracies, and in some cases, it's in democracies that go to the polls, or countries, I should say, that go to the polls but are not democracies. For instance, I don't think that the elections in Russia are going to change the regime that is in power in Russia. But 4.2 billion people going to the polls in some shape or form. That's the largest election year in global history. It's the largest election year that will happen in this generation. It's the largest election year until about 2048 at soonest. And so that's number one. Number two is this election year is happening at a time of crazy, hypercharged technological change. If you can think to the last, at least US presidential cycle, 2020, there wasn't such a thing as ChatGPT. And now we're on ChatGPT 4. We could be on ChatGPT another number by the time we go to the polls in the United States. And so the pace of technological change is accelerating. And that doesn't account for the fact that we're at a moment in human history to begin with, even outside of that technological change, where humans are more connected with each other and have more access to information, either accurate or inaccurate, than at any point in human history. And so all of those factors are coming together, and the only thing that is absolutely certain is that the world is going to look a lot different at the end of this global election year.
Biden administration thought of a thing called Defense of Democracy Alliance. Can democracies, as liberal democracies in these times of huge acceleration of technology and cognitive, I cannot use the word because it's a dirty word, but mind something, can be saved?
It would be very difficult to do the work that we do every single day without the belief that it can be saved. So that's number one. And I think the second component of that is that in democracies over, let's say, the last half decade, we've done a fairly good job of articulating all of the things, especially in online information environments or hyper-connected or technological vulnerabilities. We've done a very good job of articulating what we're against, the threats that we're trying to mitigate, the vulnerabilities that we're really, really nervous about. But we haven't really grounded that work in the thing that we stand for, which is we're against things like foreign interference that happen online during elections because we, as open, free democracies, stand for an internet, in this case, that is free, open, secure, interoperable, and produces mostly reliable or mostly trustworthy information for people to make decisions, come together during things like elections and make decisions together. Or able to navigate the online information environment during crises like a global pandemic in which consuming information really impacts your ability to make decisions about your life and your livelihood.
Talking about that, we have like some buzzwords or buzz concepts that are circulating around, from digital resilience to cognitive resilience to fostering critical thinking. Is it possible with what has happened until now, with the influence of social media and all the things that basically target the voters in unsecure times like this?
I think the term that we come back to most often, at least in our work at the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab, is this concept of information integrity. And so where we talk about news literacy or digital literacy or basic civic engagement, what it means to be a citizen in a digital age, a lot of that connects to this broader concept of information integrity. Not only articulating the things that are vulnerabilities or the things that we need to address, but what we proactively stand for. And where the conversation on information integrity breaks down is at the surface level of information integrity. Mis and disinformation, which are technical terms that are now politically debated, right? There's a lot of political connotation between them. But what information integrity actually includes is not only that surface level engagement in online spaces, where a lot of things like social dialogue happen at this point, it also includes the governance, how we decide to make rules for those spaces. Things like in Europe, the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act, how we govern online platforms. But it also includes the infrastructure of those platforms. The actual industrial need to have things like cables or satellites that connect us to a global internet, to a global information environment. And when I say a global information environment, we have to understand that having an open global dialogue, it might make us uncomfortable sometimes. It might make making decisions together in democracies a little bit harder. And yet, that's the best system that we have to stand up against things like rising authoritarianism or autocracies in which only a few people want to have power to make decisions. And so it all comes back to this idea of information integrity and how to protect what is free and open in a technological age.
When you say information integrity, it's interesting when we have in our public spaces people that contest something that we call a fact. Mm-hmm. Because the fact is that Earth is round, it's not flat. But we still have something called fact-checking. Right. So which information, and what kind of integrity in these kind of times when you have like parallel worlds and parallel truths that don't, overlap, and you have social fabrics completely falling apart because of that, because we don't have a space to talk, because we have completely different understanding of basic things and of fact.
For me, that surface level of information integrity isn't a binary, meaning information integrity doesn't mean that this is right or this is wrong, or that there isn't room for debate. Debate in a changing set of information or a changing fact pattern during things like elections or during things like emergencies, public health emergencies, things like that. Facts change. If the information that we have at hand to make decisions changes, it should. There's new information consistently. And so to me, information integrity isn't that binary of true or false. It's making sure that we have a rights-respecting, rights-protecting approach for all of the new ways that we consume information and engage with one another, to protect that debate, and to protect a right to information. And by a right to information, what we're talking about is protecting my ability to stand up and say what I think, to express my view, to associate with whoever I want to be associating with. But also to protect your right to access accurate information. So my right to say whatever I want doesn't include, my right to say whatever is protected by my free speech doesn't automatically mean that I get reach to everybody in the world with whatever my viewpoint is. If my viewpoint is factually incorrect, then perhaps I shouldn't be amplified across the world and across all of these platforms. Because your right to information, to accurate information, to make decisions about your family, your life, your livelihood, needs to be protected. And the technological landscape for a hyper-connected information environment, the technical means by which we communicate with each other, is again rapidly changing. And so we've got to be able to navigate that set of equities in a more coherent way. And that comes with trade-offs, and it's a really, really hard challenge to have in order to, again, be for something, protecting free, open, secure information environments.
You have a background in national security, in stratcom and policy making. So if you put all of that together, what do you see as main risks today concerning what we talk about, you know, in this disinformation landscape that we're living in election year?
You know, given a background in security, given a background in engaging with publics, the answer for me might be somewhat surprising. And the answer for me is not a technological change. It's not an existential threat coming from some other country. It's the fact that we don't all have a common belief that this system of democracy is working for us. And unless we all have a shared stake in that system, unless we all believe that that system is the best way by which we can achieve collective outcomes together, do big things together going into the future, to navigate an era of rapid technological change, to navigate an era in which geopolitical competition is rising, then we will inherently have backfooted ourselves. We will have inherently put ourselves, will have chosen to put ourselves at a disadvantage. And that's really, really concerning because we're choosing to do that. We still have the ability to determine our outcomes. And so we all have to come together and actually believe that this system can achieve outcomes.
The biggest amplifier or the amplifier itself are social media or social networks. How do you call it? You've mentioned regulation and what EU is doing. Can US do the same? Where are you at the moment?
There's a strong variance in approach between how the United States, including at the state and local and national level, are addressing regulating social media platforms, as opposed to how the EU and member states of the EU are attempting to do the same thing. For any number of reasons, the US has a patchwork approach, has created some amount of generational regulations that probably need to be updated. The main regulation that is governing liability for social media platforms, whether social media platforms will be held responsible for things that are posted on those platforms, was written in the early 90s. And the internet is a lot different place than it was in the early 90s. And so that probably needs to be updated. Whereas the EU has taken a stronger deliberative approach to really, really robust regulation and creating approaches for individual citizens to have a certain set of standards that they'll expect from social platforms. So not only what is happening what are the regulations that are being implemented right now, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, but also standards before that on baseline data privacy, the GDPR, which the GDPR was is only enforced in the EU, but it costs the platforms more to only enforce it in the EU as opposed to enforce it across most of their platforms around the world. And so that becomes a global standard. And so where we spend a lot of our time as policymakers is looking at limited jurisdictions like the EU or like the US, or even limited jurisdictions within industry. If a very large platform sets a precedent, that will become a global standard, and then figuring out how to shape those global standards over time towards more transparency, more accountability, and more measured belief that folks can engage on those platforms in a coherent way and rely on the information that they are consuming in increasing amounts, less from traditional news sources and more on social media.
Can you explain what Digital Forensic Research Lab is doing?
Yeah, the Digital Forensic Research Lab is a team of about 36 researchers that do open source research. And so 36 researchers that are spread out all around the world in 17 different countries on 4 different continents. And the whole point is that they're looking at online information environments and better understanding those online information environments' impact on society. During times of crisis, a lot of verification of what is happening in conflict zones, places like Ukraine, places like Gaza right now. During processes like elections, that are heightened information environments in which the information is pretty consistently changing and everybody's coming together to make big decisions, or just in normal course. How reliable are those information environments on a day-to-day basis for the local economy or for engagement in social life? So that's what the DFR Lab is doing. We're looking at open information environments to better understand this moment in history.
How can we make our citizens more aware or resilient, or do you think that, you know, all of this that was happening in the last two election cycles kind of strengthened themselves to understand and to be more critical on what they are getting as informations or not?
Well, I think any number of world events have driven more awareness about the impact of online information environments, the way that we engage and communicate with each other in online or digital spaces, and what that means for our lives. And I don't think that you can discount large global events, elections around the world, including the US in 2016, 2020, the last UK elections, elections in India, elections in Brazil, major global elections as a focal point, but also any number of conflicts. The ongoing conflict, Russia's war against Ukraine right now, the conflict in Gaza right now, as well as global moments. We all sat at home for 2 years during a global pandemic in which one of the only mechanisms that we were engaging with each other around the world was through online spaces, because engaging with each other in physical spaces was not proven to be safe. So we've had any number of kind of historical moments over the last half decade or so that have driven up the stakes. And then there's this layer of, again, rapid technological change, heightened geopolitical competition, and the stakes could not be higher. Democracy is backsliding, or has been backsliding for some amount of time, with this being somewhat of an accelerant to that. This being the way that we engage in digital spaces, and the way that various vulnerabilities in digital spaces have accelerated things like a detachment from a shared set of facts, or a detachment from the belief that democracy is a viable system.
So how do we tackle, or you think we should tackle, these trends that basically spill over in real life in the concept of mistrust in traditional institutions or polarization that we're witnessing?
The bad news is that there is no catch-all cure. There isn't one thing that we're going to do in which we're all going to wake up tomorrow and have full trust in online spaces and in large tech platforms and our governments. There's no catch-all solution. The good news is that we all have something that we can do to chip away and build resilience, or build back that trust that is diminished over time.
And that is?
And that it includes any number of things. It includes, it's a little like a multiple choice test in school. Mm-hmm. If you have options A, B, C, D, and then E is all of the above, we've got to do all of the above. And at the citizen level, that means being really, really aware of how we're engaging, taking responsibility for the information that we consume on a day-to-day basis, participating in democratic processes, taking the extra steps to make sure that we have all the information at hand, and that our friends and family do as well. That's step number one. That's the thing that you and I can do today without any cost of time or money, you know? We can do that. And then at the systems level, we've got to have a more proactive vision for technology and its role in free and open societies. We've got to be proactively for something in that space, as opposed to just against various threats, or just scared of various changes. And democracies have to update themselves. We have to make sure that the cogs of democracy are working and going around at all times. And that means that we got to change the way that we show up and participate in government. It means that our elected officials have to change the way that they show up and do politics. The other stakeholders include folks like media, folks like civil society actors, and we've all got a role to play in building back trust in this at a global level, rules-based order, at a national level, national multipolar democracies that are inclusive as opposed to exclusive of people, and at an individual level, just being good citizens in communities in which we have a lot of agency to get up and choose what we're going to do in the morning.
And for the end, you've mentioned ChatGPT, the last global risk report published before World Economic Forum said that AI-driven misinformation is one of the biggest global risks. Where do you see AI in this context?
AI in the context of disinformation is an accelerant. AI isn't creating new types of disinformation. It's not creating new types of human behavior yet. It might shape how disinformation is spread. It might shape how disinformation is created. It might shape human behavior over time. But right now, what AI does to the challenge that is disinformation meaning false information spread maliciously or intentionally. AI is an accelerant to that. And specifically, mostly what we're talking about in this conversation is generative artificial intelligence, meaning tooling that helps create content at a larger scale and in a faster way. Things like deep fake or synthetic media. Things like, if it's text-based disinformation, scripting that can help produce text a lot faster. But AI-enabled disinformation has existed for some amount of time. DFR Lab going back to, 2018, we were looking at botnets on social media platforms with profile photos, pictures, that were GAN-generated. GAN-generated meaning created with AI tooling, fake faces. And we've seen any number of AI-enabled information threats beyond disinformation for a long time now. Things like things that make us really uncomfortable, like harassment using deepfake pornography. That's been a very large, nefarious industry for a lot longer than the last year. And so looking at the scale of AI-enabled information threats that we have right now and that have existed in recent history is a lot different than a perception that there's something really, really, really new going on, as opposed to something that is accelerating and potentially accelerating really, really fast in a dangerous way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.